think it's a fair discussion to have in what should be counted as indirect costs for different universities, and what should be counted, what should be paid for as part of a grant budget, and what have you, and what shouldn't be paid for. So, if you've been watching the news in the last few days, I'm recording this over a weekend, and pardon the cats maybe running in the background, but anyway, if you've been looking at the news over the last couple of weeks, you know, last couple of days rather, you know full well, and you've seen perhaps a headline related to this one that I'm showing you here about the National Institutes of Health. Cutting billions of dollars in biomedical funding effective immediately. This is as of February 7th, 2025. As I'm writing that, that's what this is about. And I'm not going to get into the opinion on whether or not this is good or bad, because the actual thing that is getting cut here, this is a little bit of a deceptive headline, but the actual thing underneath of it is the particular thing here. There's more commentary on this from the left than the center or the right in terms of the outlets. And that's the reason I picked ground.news to show you this here, because there is actually quite a range of opinions on what this means and what this is about. But that's not actually what I want to get into, because the real crux of this that's around here is around the issue of indirect costs that universities and institutions have for the cost of doing research. And so what I wanted to get into that is because I don't know that folks, from what I've seen online, it seems the discussion has, shall we say, been lacking around what the heck indirect costs actually are. And so I think that's actually more relevant to talk about here, to understand what we're talking about with indirect costs. So I'm not going to get into the opinions here. If you want to go do that yourself, you absolutely can. And I suggest looking at the ground.news website here, because there's actually plenty of great commentary here from different outlets, and you can see it here, and you can sort it out by those that are left-leaning versus center-leaning versus more right-leaning here. Here, be it from, this is just came in very shortly ago from Newsmax, so there's still actually, as of the time of this recording, commentary coming in from all over the place. You guys can go look at that. That's not the point of what I want to do with this particular video, because I would rather be informative with this one. And the informative part of this is, what the heck is actually indirect costs? When you're dealing with grant funding, and this is the more professional side of science rather than the scientific process and scientific method, hypothesis and experimentation and all that jazz, but the actual paying the bills side of things with grant funding and what have you. And where people don't realize is that there's a couple of different kinds of things that are accounted for in the budget that is provided for grant funding for different things. And part of that is the direct costs, which is to say certain things that you get involved with for the grant specifically. And then there's the indirect costs, and that goes by a couple of different names. So I figured that's a worthwhile place to start, is just to illuminate some of the differences. This is Harvard's explanation of it here. And so there's a couple of different ones that I would talk about here. And this is the reason I want to get into this, is actually Harvard does give a decent explanation, but also gives a explanation of the fact that there are multiple names for this. It's indirect costs, yes, the indirect cost rate there, but it can also be called overhead. And it's also called facilities and administration costs, or F&A costs. And the reason it's called that is because what indirect costs go towards are a lot related to those things with facilities and administrative related expenses. And in particular, the reason it also gets called indirect is because, as they say here, indirect costs are sponsored project-related expenses that cannot be directly or accurately associated with individual projects. Which is to say, best way to think of it, truthfully, is day-to-day costs of doing things that support a project, but are not necessarily directly things related, i.e., these are things that are not directly contributing, I would say, to the research done as part of a project. Like it's not going towards a specific project, but it's covering multiple projects and supporting multiple projects. And when they say sponsored project here, what they mean is a grant funded project. That's other lingo just to know from that. But and that's where it gets interesting. I actually like this primer from MIT a little bit more. Let me blow this up a little bit because it's small. But this is actually from 2017, but it's an excellent little primer on what the difference is between a direct and an indirect cost. And this is going to be a relatively short video for me just because I do want to just get into that. What is it really when you're talking about direct costs versus indirect costs? And then you can dive into the further discussion. When you're talking about indirect costs, here, this is another great explanation. This is from MIT. And this is actually in 2017 when this was written, but it's still relevant here today. So indirect costs, aka the F&A, facilities and administrative rate or overhead, represent the genuine costs of performing research that are not easily attributable to individual grants. Think of these changes as applying to think of these charges rather as applying to things that wouldn't need to exist or be used extensively if MIT didn't conduct research. Examples include the depreciation of research equipment and buildings. So as you build a building, things start breaking, things start falling apart along that line. When you're thinking of buildings and equipment needed for those particular buildings in there, one of the things that indirect costs can go towards is the maintenance and upkeep of those buildings. Laboratory utilities, light, heating, cooling, power, the electric bill, the heating, all of those kinds of things. Hazardous chemical and biological agent management, that is specific to, obviously, to chemical and medical labs more than anything else. Libraries, of course, maintaining libraries. Internet service, maintaining that. Data transmission and storage. Again, radiation safety is more about chemical related things than other types of things. So that would be more related to certain kinds of research than others, but still it counts as F&A or indirect costs if you prefer. Insurance, administrative services, and compliance with the federal, state, and local regulations, such as the institutional review boards that are there for human subject and animal research, make sure proper ethics and legality are being followed with respect to different research grants. That's what a lot of that involves in terms of indirect costs. Note that only resources utilized for research are counted in here. So all the different things that are included under indirect costs are somewhat dependent upon the university. Obviously, bigger universities, more things going on, more things get included under there. That's the nature of that business. A lot of these things here, maintenance of buildings and what have you are important. What most people don't realize is there are certain things with the compliance with federal, local, and state regulations. That's where there's a lot of administrative services at different universities that help out with the professors involved. Okay. That's the point to make in all of that. And I did want to just primarily make the point of what the hell are indirect costs when you're talking about grant funding and scientific research done at different university institutions. Yeah, you notice here, actually, because you can actually go through, and if you're curious, you can find it on any university's website, what the indirect cost rates are. Again, I'm not going into it in depth here. But it is some of the kinds of negotiations that happen with regard to NIH and others, because NIH is a funding entity, in that a funding entity can say, we only want to pay a certain amount of the indirect costs of a university. In which case, that's where some of the negotiations take place. And that is what the kerfuffle is over with respect to NIH. And the decrease that they've set in setting a maximum amount of indirect costs that they want to charge. Otherwise, that usually those indirect costs are, the indirect cost rate is itself set by the university, and they can be very different between universities. But there can be cases where an funding agency says, no, we don't want to pay, we only want to pay a certain amount of indirect costs. That's where the current kerfuffle and argument is. that if you're looking on the news related things and the response in different outlets and on social media. But more the point is when you're talking about indirect costs, that is generally what is meant. So I like this MIT definition as a really good example of what we're talking about with respect to indirect costs. Now, to just do put a little bit of my own opinion on this, I think it's a fair discussion to have in what should be counted as indirect costs for different universities, and what should be counted, what should be paid for as part of a grant budget, and what have you, and what shouldn't be paid for. That is two different conversations to have, and I'm not going to get into that latter conversation right now. But I do think it's a worthwhile discussion to have as to what should be counted as indirect costs, and what should be included, therefore, with respect to grant budgets and funding and all of those particular negotiations that go into making the research enterprise work. Now, regardless of whatever you think of the current kerfuffle, again, I'm not going to get into that per se, but that's what I did want to get into. Was like I hadn't seen it really well defined, at least in the news articles that I read. I hadn't really seen it well defined in terms of what is indirect costs exactly, and what are the multiple names for it. So for folks who are versed in the higher education space themselves, this is probably already familiar. But for those folks coming to this video who might not be as versed, that's the point in what indirect costs are supposed to be. And a lot of that is at times set by the university, but then there can also be a maximum that a funding agency is willing to pay for of those indirect cost rates. That's the point that I want to say on this. Let me know what you think on all of these different things. Hit the like button on the way out the door if you like this little bit of an informative video. Subscribe to the channel, share with your friends, all that kind of good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious.